January 17, 1942. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japan. The morning fog rolls thick across the harbor, carrying with it the sharp scent of steel and salt. Commander Nakamura Shinji stands at the dock's edge, his breath visible in the winter cold, watching as workers swarm over the hull of the light cruiser Agano. The riveting hammers echo across the water in rhythmic percussion, a sound that has defined this place for decades. Behind him, the massive dry docks stretch into the mist, each one cradling a vessel in various stages of completion. This arsenal, one of Japan's proudest industrial achievements, represents the culmination of 50 years of modernization, of transformation from feudal isolation to naval power. Nakamura has spent his entire career in these yards. He knows every crane, every slip, every craftsman by name. Today, he holds in his hand an intelligence report that will haunt him for the remainder of the war. The paper trembles slightly, not from the wind, but from what it contains. American shipyard production estimates for 1942. He reads the numbers 3 times, certain there must be an error in translation. There is no error. The figures are correct, and they are impossible. In the 17 months since the attack on Pearl Harbor stunned the world, the Imperial Japanese Navy has operated under a fundamental assumption that shaped every strategic decision, every tactical deployment, every calculation of risk and reward. That assumption, crafted in the halls of Naval General Staff Headquarters and reinforced by decades of observation, held that Japan, though smaller, though resource-poor, possessed something the Americans could never match: the warrior spirit, the discipline of purpose, and the refined craftsmanship of a people whose naval tradition stretched back to the age of sail. Japanese warships were masterpieces. Each vessel represented months, sometimes years, of meticulous construction by artisans who approached their work with near-religious devotion. The welds were perfect. The armor plating was hand-fitted. The optical equipment was the finest in the world. A single Japanese destroyer embodied more man-hours of skilled labor than any comparable Western ship. This was the source of confidence. This was the foundation upon which Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku had built his strategy: strike hard, strike fast, inflict such devastating losses that the Americans would negotiate rather than endure a long war of attrition. But Nakamura now understands that the entire premise was catastrophically wrong. The Americans were not playing the same game. They were not building ships the Japanese way. They were building ships the American way, and the difference would decide the war. The intelligence report details something that seems, to Japanese naval strategists, like a fever dream or propaganda: the United States Maritime Commission's emergency shipbuilding program. The Americans have not simply increased production. They have industrialized shipbuilding in a manner never before attempted in human history. They have taken the construction of ocean-going vessels, a process that traditionally required skilled shipwrights, years of apprenticeship, and painstaking individual attention, and transformed it into something resembling an automobile assembly line. At a place called Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, a man named Henry J. Kaiser, who had never built a ship before the war, is producing Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels, in an average of 42 days. 42 days. From keel-laying to launch. The fastest Japanese equivalent takes 6 months. But the numbers are worse than speed. They are about scale. The report estimates that American shipyards will launch approximately 8 million tons of shipping in 1942 alone. 8 million tons. By comparison, Japan's entire shipbuilding industry, operating at maximum wartime capacity, will produce roughly 600,000 tons, and that includes merchant vessels, not just warships. The arithmetic is brutal and inescapable. For every ship Japan builds, America will build more than 13. But even this understates the imbalance, because the American production is accelerating, not plateauing. The infrastructure being constructed across the United States, new shipyards, new foundries, new training facilities, represents not a wartime surge but a permanent transformation of industrial capacity. By 1943, the report suggests, American production may reach 12 million tons annually. By 1944, perhaps 15 million. Nakamura folds the report carefully and places it inside his jacket, close to his heart, as though proximity might help him comprehend what his mind cannot quite accept. He looks again at the Agano, still months from completion despite round-the-clock shifts. He thinks of the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, pride of the fleet, which took 3 years each to build. He thinks of the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, floating fortresses that consumed the labor of thousands and represented the pinnacle of naval engineering, yet together displaced less tonnage than the Americans would launch in a single month. How had they not seen this coming? The answer lies not in intelligence failure, but in imagination failure. The Japanese war planners had studied American industrial capacity. They knew the United States produced more steel, more oil, more of virtually every strategic resource. But they had assumed, in the way that experts in one system often cannot envision an entirely different system, that American shipbuilding would follow the same patterns as Japanese shipbuilding, merely scaled up proportionally. They had assumed craftsmanship. They had assumed traditional methods. They had assumed limits that simply did not exist. What they failed to grasp was that America would approach shipbuilding not as a craft but as a problem of mass production, and that American industry possessed something Japan could never replicate: a culture of standardization, mechanization, and logistical innovation born from decades of continental-scale manufacturing. The same principles that allowed Ford to produce a Model T every 24 seconds would now be applied to vessels displacing thousands of tons. The shock was not merely quantitative. It was philosophical. The Japanese Naval Officer Corps had been raised on a particular vision of warfare, a vision in which quality transcended quantity, in which the superior spirit of the warrior could overcome material disadvantage, in which the decisive battle, fought with courage and skill, would determine the outcome of the conflict. This vision was not mere propaganda. It was rooted in genuine historical experience. Japan had defeated China in 1895 despite facing a larger navy. Japan had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905 despite being outgunned. These victories had been achieved through superior training, superior tactics, and superior morale. The lesson absorbed by an entire generation of Japanese officers was that these intangible factors could compensate for material inferiority. When Admiral Yamamoto planned the Pearl Harbor attack, he did so knowing that Japan could not win a protracted war of attrition. His strategy was to inflict such devastating losses in the war's opening phase that American morale would crack, that the American public would lose the will to fight across 5,000 miles of ocean for possessions that seemed distant and abstract. But there was a fatal assumption embedded in this strategy, that Americans viewed war the way Japanese did, as a test of national will, of honor, of spirit. They did not. Americans viewed war as a problem to be solved through logistics, through production, through the application of overwhelming material force. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not break American morale. It unified it, and it activated an industrial capacity that Japanese planners had intellectually acknowledged but never emotionally grasped. Within weeks of the attack, the United States had begun the largest military-industrial mobilization in history. Factories that had produced automobiles were retooled for tanks. Factories that had produced refrigerators were retooled for artillery shells. And shipyards, both existing and newly constructed, were retooled for the mass production of vessels on a scale that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier. The symbol of this transformation was the Liberty ship, a deliberately unglamorous vessel that embodied everything the Japanese found incomprehensible about American industrial philosophy. The Liberty ship was not beautiful. It was not innovative. It was not even particularly seaworthy in heavy weather. It was a copy of a British design from the First World War, simplified and standardized for rapid construction. Its hull was welded rather than riveted, a technique that Japanese shipwrights regarded as inferior, prone to catastrophic failure. Its engine was a cheap, mass-produced reciprocating steam engine rather than the more efficient turbines used in Japanese merchant ships. By every measure of craftsmanship, the Liberty ship was crude. But by the only measure that mattered in total war, the measure of production speed and volume, it was a revolution. The Liberty ships were constructed in sections at factories across the United States, then transported to assembly yards where they were welded together like children's toys. Workers who had never seen a ship before December 1941 were building ocean-going freighters by March 1942. Women, previously excluded from heavy industry, made up a significant portion of the workforce. The Kaiser yards employed an 18-year-old welder named Wendy the Welder, a publicity figure who symbolized the democratization of skilled labor through standardized processes and training. The speed records became a matter of national pride and psychological warfare. In November 1942, the Robert E. Peary was assembled in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. 4 days. The vessel was fully operational and at sea within a week. Newsreels of the launch were shown in theaters across America and broadcast internationally. The message was unmistakable. American industry could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. By the end of 1942, American shipyards had launched 746 Liberty ships alone, each one capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. But Liberty ships were only the beginning. Alongside them, the yards were producing fleet oilers, escort carriers, destroyer escorts, tank landing ships, and dozens of other vessel types, each standardized, each mass-produced, each contributing to a maritime avalanche that would eventually total more than 5,000 ships by war's end. The psychological impact on Japanese planners was devastating because it invalidated the entire strategic framework. Every battle plan, every calculation of acceptable losses, had been based on the assumption of a limited American replacement capacity. Japanese submarines targeted American merchant shipping in the Pacific, sinking vessels at a rate that would have crippled any other nation's logistics. But the Americans simply built faster than the Japanese could sink. By mid-1943, American shipyards were launching more tonnage each month than Japanese submarines sank in an entire year. The arithmetic of attrition, which was supposed to favor the defender, had been inverted. Japan could not build, could not replace, could not sustain. America could do all three simultaneously while also supporting the British, the Soviets, and the Chinese with Lend-Lease shipments. Commander Nakamura understood this before most of his colleagues would admit it. He understood that the war was already lost, not on any battlefield but in the foundries and assembly yards of a nation that approached warfare as an engineering problem. The Japanese had prepared to fight a war of the spirit. The Americans had prepared to fight a war of steel. And steel, in sufficient quantity, was invincible. But the disparity extended beyond merchant shipping. The American naval construction program, once fully activated, dwarfed anything the Axis powers could achieve collectively. In 1942, the United States commissioned 15 fleet carriers and escort carriers. Japan commissioned 2. In 1943, the United States commissioned 50 carriers of various types. Japan commissioned 3. By 1944, the numbers had become obscene. American yards launched over 100 carriers while Japanese yards struggled to complete a handful, most of which were conversions from existing hulls because new construction had become impossible due to resource shortages. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been celebrated in Japan as a temporary setback. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was devastating, but the Naval General Staff believed that superior training and doctrine would compensate in subsequent battles. What they failed to understand was that America would replace those Japanese losses 50 times over, while Japan would never recover the industrial capacity to rebuild its carrier force. The disparity was even more pronounced in smaller vessels. American destroyer production alone exceeded the entire Japanese naval construction program. The Fletcher-class destroyers, workhorses of the Pacific War, were produced in staggering numbers. 175 were built between 1942 and 1945, each one a capable, well-armed vessel that could perform escort, anti-submarine, and surface combat missions. Japanese destroyer production, by contrast, totaled 32 vessels across all classes during the same period, and many of those were completed using materials and components scavenged from damaged ships. By 1944, Japanese destroyers were being used not as combat vessels but as high-speed transports for resupply missions to isolated garrisons. Missions that became known as the Tokyo Express, or Rat Run, desperate nighttime dashes to avoid American air superiority. And even these missions became unsustainable as American submarines and aircraft decimated the destroyer force faster than it could be replaced. The submarine war provided perhaps the clearest illustration of the industrial imbalance. Japanese submarines, particularly the I-400 class, were technological marvels, the largest submarines in the world until the nuclear age, capable of carrying aircraft, of traveling 30,000 miles without refueling. They were masterpieces of engineering. But Japan built only 3 I-400 class submarines during the entire war. The United States, by contrast, built 228 Gato-class submarines alone, plus scores of other types. American submarines were not as individually impressive as their Japanese counterparts, but they were available in overwhelming numbers, and they were supported by a logistics network that allowed them to remain on station far longer than Japanese subs. American submarines sank more than 1,300 Japanese merchant ships totaling over 5 million tons, effectively strangling Japan's ability to import the oil, rubber, and raw materials necessary to sustain the war effort. And when American submarines were lost, they were replaced within months. When Japanese submarines were lost, they were gone forever. But perhaps the most crushing realization for Japanese naval strategists was that American industrial capacity was not even fully mobilized for shipbuilding. The United States was simultaneously conducting a two-front war, supporting allies across the globe, maintaining a strategic bombing campaign against Germany, developing atomic weapons, and still producing consumer goods in quantities that seemed obscene to a nation enduring rationing and deprivation. Reports from diplomatic sources in neutral countries described American cities where civilians complained about shortages of butter and gasoline while consuming meat, sugar, and manufactured goods in quantities that would have represented luxury in Tokyo. The American home front was not suffering. It was booming. War production had ended the Great Depression. Unemployment had virtually disappeared. Wages had risen. The American industrial economy was operating at a level of output that exceeded the combined production of every Axis nation combined, and it was doing so while maintaining, even increasing, civilian living standards. This was incomprehensible. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent, obsessed with material comfort and incapable of the sacrifice necessary for total war. But the reality was precisely the opposite. American material abundance was not a weakness but the foundation of military power. The Americans did not need to choose between guns and butter. They produced both in quantities that made choosing unnecessary. The worker building Liberty ships in Richmond, California, earned wages that allowed him to buy a house, a car, and provide for his family at a standard of living unimaginable to his Japanese counterpart. This was not decadence. It was the economic foundation of sustainable war production. Well-fed, well-paid, well-housed workers were more productive, more motivated, and more capable of maintaining the round-the-clock shifts necessary for total mobilization. The Japanese system, by contrast, relied on exhortations to sacrifice, on appeals to patriotism and duty, on expectations that workers would endure hardship for the national cause. And they did endure, with remarkable stoicism and dedication. But human endurance has limits. Productivity declines when workers are malnourished, exhausted, and demoralized by the gap between propaganda and reality. By 1943, the disparity had become visible even to ordinary Japanese citizens. The newsreels no longer showed victorious naval battles. The communiques spoke of strategic withdrawals and consolidating defensive positions. The ration portions shrank. The air raid sirens became routine. And the men who returned from the front, those who returned at all, brought stories that contradicted everything the public had been told. They spoke of American fleets that stretched to the horizon, of bombardments that continued for days without pause, of supply dumps stacked with mountains of equipment and provisions. They spoke of being outnumbered not by margins but by orders of magnitude. A Japanese soldier defending Tarawa described watching the American preparatory bombardment and realizing that more shells were falling on the tiny atoll in a single hour than the entire Japanese garrison had fired in the preceding months. An airman who survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea described engaging American carrier groups that seemed to spawn aircraft endlessly. As soon as one wave was fought off, another appeared, and another, until the Japanese fighters ran out of fuel and ammunition and had to withdraw while the Americans continued launching strikes. The naval battles of 1944 were not battles in the traditional sense. They were massacres enabled by industrial supremacy. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, the Japanese combined fleet made its final bid to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. The Japanese fleet included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the most powerful warships ever constructed, vessels whose 18-inch guns could pierce any armor afloat. The Musashi alone displaced 73,000 tons and represented the culmination of Japanese naval architecture. During the battle, American carrier aircraft attacked the Musashi in wave after wave. The ship took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally capsizing. It took 5 hours of continuous attack to sink her, a testament to her engineering. But the lesson of the battle was not the Musashi's strength. It was the futility of individual excellence against systemic abundance. The Americans could afford to lose 50 aircraft sinking one battleship because they had thousands more. Japan could not afford to lose the Musashi because there would never be another. The Battle of Leyte Gulf effectively ended the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. The Americans lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The tonnage ratio was approximately 10 to 1. But more significant than the losses was the revelation that Japan could no longer contest American naval supremacy anywhere in the Pacific. The Americans owned the ocean. And they owned it because they had built it. The recurring symbol that came to represent American industrial supremacy, in the minds of Japanese prisoners and survivors, was not a weapon but a container, the jerry can. This prosaic object, a 5-gallon fuel container with an X-shaped indentation on its sides for strength, became a symbol of everything the Japanese industrial system could not replicate. The jerry can was a German invention, but the Americans had reverse-engineered it, improved it, and produced it in quantities exceeding 50 million units. Japanese soldiers encountering American supply dumps were stunned not by the presence of fuel was expected, but by the casual abundance. Jerry cans were stacked in pyramids dozens of feet high, left unguarded, treated as disposable. American forces used them not just for fuel but for water, for lubricants, for any liquid that needed transport. When they were empty, they were often discarded rather than returned to depot. This was not wastefulness in the conventional sense. It was a rational calculation that the cost of transporting empties back to base exceeded the cost of producing new ones. The jerry can became a metonym for American logistics, reliable, standardized, mass-produced, and available in such quantities that scarcity was not a consideration. Japanese logistics, by contrast, operated on principles of conservation and reuse. Fuel was precious. Containers were recovered, repaired, reused until they fell apart. Supply lines were tenuous, vulnerable, insufficient. As the war progressed and American submarines cut the maritime routes between Japan and its conquered territories, Japanese garrisons across the Pacific began to starve. Not from lack of food in the abstract. Japan controlled vast agricultural regions, but from inability to transport supplies across contested waters. Soldiers on Guadalcanal resorted to eating tree bark and grass. Soldiers on Guadalcanal resorted to eating tree bark and grass. Soldiers on New Guinea died of starvation in greater numbers than from combat. The word, hokyu, resupply, became a bitter joke. Soldiers sang sardonic songs about supplies that never came, about promises that turned to ash. Meanwhile, American forces established supply networks of such efficiency that frontline troops received hot meals, mail from home, and even ice cream. The discrepancy was not merely material. It was psychological. Japanese soldiers fought with the courage of desperation, knowing that no help was coming. American soldiers fought with the confidence of men who knew that behind them stood the full weight of an industrial colossus that would never abandon them. By 1945, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. The American submarine blockade had reduced Japanese merchant shipping to a fraction of its pre-war total. Oil imports had virtually ceased. The once mighty combined fleet was reduced to a handful of vessels, most of them unable to sortie due to fuel shortages. The naval construction program had collapsed entirely, not from lack of will but from lack of steel, lack of workers, many of whom had been conscripted into the army, and lack of components. The few ships under construction would never be completed. Meanwhile, American shipyards continued to operate at peak capacity, launching vessels that would arrive too late for the war but would dominate the post-war maritime world. The final accounting was almost incomprehensible in its disparity. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built approximately 6,500 naval and merchant vessels totaling over 53 million tons. Japan, during the same period, built approximately 670 vessels totaling 4 million tons. Germany and Italy combined added perhaps another 2 million tons. The United States alone had outbuilt the entire Axis coalition by a factor of nearly 9-1. But the numbers, stark as they were, understated the true dimension of the victory because American shipbuilding was merely one component of a fully integrated industrial system. The ships required steel, American foundries produced it. They required engines, American factories built them. They required electronics, American companies manufactured them. They required crews, American training facilities produced them. Every ship was a node in a network of production that encompassed the entire continental United States and, increasingly, the world. The Liberty ships that carried supplies across the Pacific were built in California, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Maine. They burned oil from Texas. They carried grain from Kansas, beef from Nebraska, ammunition from Connecticut, and vehicles from Michigan. They were escorted by destroyers built in Massachusetts and submarines built in Wisconsin. They were repaired in floating dry docks built in Louisiana. The system was continental in scale, redundant by design, and immune to the kind of strategic bombing that might cripple a more concentrated industrial base. The Japanese had gambled everything on the belief that spirit could overcome material, that the decisive battle would be decided by courage and skill rather than tonnage and production capacity. They had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the evidence of their error now lay rusting in harbors across the Pacific, the shattered hulks of a navy that had once been the third most powerful in the world. Commander Nakamura, if he survived the war, records are incomplete, would have witnessed the final irony in the autumn of 1945, American occupation forces arriving in Japan aboard ships so numerous that they darkened the horizon, offloading supplies in such quantities that they prevented famine in the defeated nation. The same industrial system that had crushed Japan militarily now sustained it in defeat, demonstrating that American abundance was not a temporary wartime phenomenon but a permanent characteristic of a fully industrialized democratic society. The lesson was written in steel and welded into history. Ideologies may inspire, strategies may dazzle, warriors may fight with unmatched courage, but wars between industrial nations are won in the factories, the foundries, and the shipyards, where the unglamorous work of production determines the fate of empires. Japan had built masterpieces. America had built an avalanche. And when the masterpiece met the avalanche, excellence was buried under tonnage, craftsmanship was drowned in volume, and the warrior spirit was extinguished not by superior courage but by superior logistics. In the end, the Pacific War was not decided at Midway or Iwo Jima or Okinawa, though those battles mattered. It was decided in the shipyards of Richmond and Portland and Quincy, where workers who had never imagined building a ship produced them by the hundreds, where welders fresh from farms and factories proved that democracy, when fully mobilized, could generate power on a scale that authoritarian efficiency could never match. The jerrycans stacked in towering pyramids, the Liberty ships launched in days rather than months, the carriers rolling off production lines like automobiles, these were not merely weapons. They were arguments, irrefutable and forged in steel, that free people, properly organized and motivated, could outproduce, outsupply, and ultimately overwhelm any system built on conquest and subjugation. Commander Nakamura had stood in the fog that January morning, holding a report that contained the truth. By the time the truth became undeniable to the rest of Japan, millions had died, cities had been incinerated, and an empire had been reduced to rubble. But the truth was always there, visible to anyone willing to see it. America had not merely built more ships than the Axis combined. America had built a future in which industrial capacity, not martial valor, would determine the hierarchy of nations. And in that future, which became our present, the descendants of those shipyard workers would inherit a world shaped by the simple, revolutionary proposition that abundance, when harnessed to purpose, is the ultimate form of power, not because it makes warriors braver, but because it makes bravery beside the point. The war was over before it began. The only question was how long it would take for everyone to realize it. The fog lifts. The harbor is silent now. The cranes are still. But somewhere across the Pacific, in a dozen American ports whose names most Japanese have never heard, the hammers are ringing, the welders are working, and the ships, always more ships, are sliding into the water, carrying with them the tide of history itself.